Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I'd like to welcome you to the public meeting for the draft response plan for the 2550 Irving Street site. We would have liked to have been with you in person and do hope that your community is doing well. We've had the opportunity to speak with a number of you about the site and look forward to our continued discussion tonight. My name is Asha Sethi, and I'm a public participation specialist with the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. I'll be facilitating the public comment portion of this meeting and encourage you to provide us with feedback. I have a few opening announcements to get us started. This meeting is being recorded. This is a Zoom webinar, so you've all entered in viewer mode with cameras and mics turned off. We do have Chinese interpretation available for this meeting. So find the language options for both Cantonese and Mandarin. Just click on the globe interpretation icon that you can find at the bottom of the screen. And if anyone is in need of live transcription, please let us know and we can turn that feature on. Now I'd like to introduce you to the other DTSC staff that will be part of tonight's presentation. First, we have Arthur Machado, who's the project manager for the site. Can you say hi, Arthur?
Hello, everyone. Hi.
And then we have Kim Walsh, who's a unit supervisor in the cleanup program. Can you say hi, Kim?
Hi, everyone.
And we also have Vivek Mithrani, who's a toxicologist in the cleanup program. Can you say hi, Vivek?
Good evening, and thank you for coming.
Great, thank you all. The next slide, please. Next, I'll go over how to participate in this Zoom webinar. There's two ways you can participate. During the presentation, you can type a question by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. We will be monitoring these to see if there's any quick clarifying questions that we can answer along the way. Otherwise, please bear with us and we'll get to your questions after the end of the presentation. And after the presentation, we'll also take questions using the raise hand icon, which you can also find at the bottom of the screen. And then when we call on you, you'll be able to unmute yourself at that time. For anyone calling in, there's a way to raise your hand and unmute yourself. And that's by dialing *9 to raise your hand. And then to unmute yourself, you'll have to dial *6 when you're called on. We'll alternate between phone callers, Q&As typed in, and those that have raised hands. In case we do encounter any technical difficulties, let's try and have patience with each other. If you're unfamiliar with using Zoom webinar, we will do our best to assist you. Next slide, please. Next, I'll go over our agenda for this meeting. Kim Walsh will provide a DTSC overview, and our project manager, Arthur Machado, will provide a presentation about the site history and remediation process, the proposed response plan, and next steps. Our toxicologist, Vivek Mithrani, will also present information about screening levels as part of the presentation, and then we'll have the remainder of the time to answer your questions and receive your comments. That's it for opening announcements. And before we continue with our presentation, I'd like to invite Supervisor Marr, who has requested to say a few words. So let's see if we have Supervisor Marr on the line here. Okay, I am not seeing Supervisor Marr quite yet. So we'll go ahead and continue with our presentation, and we will bring Supervisor Marr in at a later time. So now I'd like to hand the presentation over to Kim Walsh.
Thank you, Asha. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. As Asha mentioned earlier, I'm Kim Walsh, and I'm a unit chief in the DTSC Site Mitigation and Restoration Program. The Site Mitigation Program is responsible for evaluation and remediation of contaminated properties throughout California. Our office in Berkeley is responsible for sites from the Oregon border to Monterey County, along the coast, and around the Bay Area. Our charter includes overseeing sites investigated and remediated under the California Land Reuse and Revitalization Act, or CLARA. The 2550 Irving Street site is one of many redevelopment sites where DTSC is overseeing the response to site contamination under CLARA. However, decisions about land use are the responsibility of our local government partners, with input from the public through the land use planning process. Under CLARA, DTSC is focused on ensuring public health protection during redevelopment and after the building is complete. Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Arthur Machado, our project manager, to discuss the response plan for the 2550 Irving site. Arthur?
Thank you so much, Kim. And again, thank you all for joining us this evening. I would first like to introduce you all to the project members that are related to the 2550 Irving Street project. As you can see here in the left-hand column, we have the DTSC staff who are all involved in the Irving Street project. And in the right-hand column, you can see the proponent developer, the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, Tndc. You also see the current property owner as well, the Police Credit Union. With us today on the call is myself. Whitney Smith is currently unavailable, but will be returning within the next few weeks. And we have Asha Sethi, who is a public participation specialist who was speaking earlier, and then Vivek Mathrani, our toxicologist working on this project, who will also speak later in this presentation. An introduction to the site and where DTSC is overseeing this project. As you can see here, pull up my pointer for all of you. As you can see, the site is highlighted in blue. This is the currently used by the Police Credit Union, but this is where the proposed residential development from Tndc will take place. The southern parking lot parcel south of Irving Street is also owned and operated by the Police Credit Union. And we also have another DTSC site, the former Albright Cleaners, which is in the very early stages of the project, but will also be undergoing DTSC oversight in the near future. Background and history on the 2550 Irving Street site. Originally, the site was a property that housed several businesses. This included 2 gas stations, a dry cleaner, and I believe a drugstore in its earlier time. Following its time as a dry cleaner and a gas station, it was used as a mortuary, funeral, and chapel, and then later modified and redeveloped to house a bank, which then was owned and operated by the Police Credit Union from 1987 to its current day. In 2019 and 2020, the Police Credit Union, while they were doing their due diligence, prepared a phase 1 environmental site assessment and later conducted multiple environmental investigations within and outside of the property. And then in 2020, Tndc proposed to redevelop the site to affordable housing complex, and at which point Tndc entered into an agreement with DTSC, while TPC, or the credit union, was already involved with an agreement to then address environmental conditions further. Tndc entered into a CLERA agreement, and CLERA stands for the California Land Reuse and Revitalization Act. This is separate from the regulatory framework than what a standard voluntary cleanup agreement is. The standard voluntary cleanup agreement is what DTSC currently has with the Police Credit Union and is pursuing with the former Albright Cleaners. The difference is the CLERA encourages the revitalization of contaminated properties across California by providing liability protection to innocent and prospective landowners. This essentially means that they are liable for their on-site or the prospective property they're purchasing, and they're not responsible or liable for any off-site impact originating from the property. That is with the former landowner or almost prospective former landowner. But the CLERA establishes a process for conducting a site assessment and response action as necessary for a safe redevelopment. And Tndc has already prepared a site assessment plan and report of findings, which concluded, based off the previous investigations on the site, that a response action would be necessary if a residential development is going to take place there. Okay. And this is a high overview of DTSC's oversight process. At the beginning, when DTSC is brought into a project or initiates a site, there is a site investigation phase conducted by the responsible party. This is to characterize the extent of contamination originating from a property or impacting a property, which is taken place through field investigation. And once data is collected following these field investigations, then we at DTSC, with the responsible party, evaluate the potential risk for current users, future users, and anyone offsite impacted by the contamination. For this project, a response plan or remedial document is prepared. And while this is developed, the proponent will develop these and then present them to DTSC, where they recommend an action necessary for their site or for any offsite if they're responsible for that. And once once DTSC is able to comment on the response plan and their comments are addressed by the responsible party, then this goes out for public comment. And that's where in the stage we're actually at right now, where this response plan prepared by Tndc is now proposing this response action for the community to then have your input in it. Once the public comment period is over, DTSC is able to collate all of the responses and then provide responses to comment document to the community addressing all of your comments. Then the response plan would then be approved and the response action design process would begin, where community protection measures are then discussed and further designed, and then to secure any necessary permits from city, county, or other regulatory agencies that may be required depending on the response action necessary. And the response action is implemented during development, and following development, then the monitoring and maintenance ongoing in perpetuity forever with the mitigation or response actions lifetime takes place. At the beginning of this project, as I mentioned, on-site investigations are the first step. And on-site investigations were conducted at the Police Credit Union 2550 Irving Street property in 2019 and 2020. There was soil, groundwater, and soil vapor and indoor air sampling collected within the boundary of the property. And indoor air was collected within the credit union building itself. The contaminant of concern was not detected, and this was tetrafluoroethylene, or also known as PCE or PERC, was not detected above screening levels for soil and groundwater, but it was detected in solvent gas and indoor air. And to talk more about screening levels, I will hand this over to Vivek Nathrani, who will elaborate on this more for everybody.
And moving ahead, Arthur, would you mind advancing the slide? Thank you. So in our DTSC site investigations, we often refer to a tool called screening levels. And screening levels are chemical and scenario specific. They are published concentrations used to identify chemicals of potential concern. And the case here for this site is perchloroethylene, or PCE. That is the only chemical that is exceeding screening levels. A chemical at concentrations above its screening level do not necessarily present a health risk. It only means that additional evaluation should take place for the pathway of concern, which is the vapor intrusion pathway that we are investigating, given that concentrations in soil vapor have exceeded their respective screening levels for PCE. Screening levels are very stringent, and that's because they have multiple precautionary assumptions built in to be protective of public health. So essentially, when we start investigating a site and concentrations are above their screening levels, we aspire to work within a range before and manage contamination before we anticipate adverse health effects to be realized because of the precautionary assumptions that are built into the screening level. DTSC soil vapor screening levels, which have been applied thus far at the site, given the site data that we've seen, those soil vapor screening levels are calculated with an assumed high attenuation factor to target DTSC's air screening level. The air screening level will be applied once we have indoor air data for properties that will be investigated. An attenuation factor is the fraction of soil vapor that is measured in indoor air. So when we assume a high attenuation factor, that means that we're giving a stringent and health protective assumption that a high rate of flux of soil vapor is intruding into indoor air. In our decision framework for risk management, if concentrations exceed 100 times the cancer screening level or exceed the non-cancer screening level, then an immediate response action should follow. So the timeline for investigation is accelerated. Next slide, please. And specific to perchloroethylene or PCE, these are the two sets of screening levels and action levels, the screening levels on the left, action levels on the right, which we are applying and may be discussed further on in our site investigation. So we have soil vapor screening levels, which define our point of departure. Below these screening levels, we typically say that concentrations are not below DTSC's level of concern and that the contaminant is not a contaminant of potential concern. On the right side, the table shows screening levels that are 100 times the screening level on the left. So that would be an action level that would represent an unacceptable potential risk. And I emphasize potential because the presence of these concentrations in soil vapor do not necessarily mean that they will be found in indoor air, because they're calculated based on an assumption that 0.03 attenuation factor is being realized. That means that 3% of the soil vapor concentration is measured in indoor air, which we see as a very health protective assumption for site investigation. And back to Arthur.
Great, thank you so much. And this will, we will discuss this more as it relates to why this response plan was being developed and how it relates to our site. But also, there are off-site investigations that were conducted by the Police Credit Union. North of Irving Street, DTSC is still actively overseeing the off-site soil vapor investigations. And this is through the standard voluntary cleanup agreement with the Police Credit Union. PCE, PERC, was also found in soil vapor there. And based off the concentrations in soil vapor, making these very conservative estimates that concentrations do not pose an unacceptable potential risk, but DTSC is still having indoor air sampled and will have indoor air sampled at the residences that soil vapor is being monitored in front to ensure that a vapor intrusion risk does not occur or exist. But south of Irving Street, DTSC is also being involved to evaluate any impact south of Irving Street of PCE. And we are in the process of entering into a standard voluntary cleanup agreement with the former Albright Cleaners. And that DTSC will provide oversight for further investigation and any potential remediation that's associated with that area. And of course, there will be future communication for both of these projects as time goes on. And yes. And this is to give you more context of the sampling locations. As I mentioned, the offsite where DTSC is monitoring the soil vapor in front of the residences, we have 3 locations on 27th Avenue, 3 locations on 26th Avenue. And currently it's proposed that indoor air samples will be collected at each of these 6 residences to further evaluate if vapor intrusion is occurring. And as you can see, there are many soil vapor samples collected within the site boundary, within 2550 Irving Street, and within Irving Street itself, and south in the Irving Street parking lot. And to further refine, there's a subset of data here just to show how this response plan, why is it necessary? Well, we see just from a subset of the samples that there was one concentration, and as Vivek mentioned earlier, there's that very high level at 1500 where there may be a potential unacceptable risk for residential, for PCE and soil vapor. While the site assessment plan and the report of findings was looking through and evaluating the data that was previously collected at the site, they saw that this 1500 concentration is right at that level of potential unacceptable risk for residents. And while this was included in their conclusions and their report of findings, they then determined that a response action was necessary if a residential development were supposed to take place there. But as you can see, there's also as you look north along the borders of the residences, this potential unacceptable risk does not extend to the northern residences, we do have sampling data points there that do show up a fairly large drop-off in concentration. So it's very much confined in the center of the site. And of course, DTSC is still monitoring the offsite north just to make sure that this risk does not extend to the northern residences or any other residences. This is more related to the current use of the Police Credit Union. The credit union, as I mentioned earlier, collected soil vapor and indoor air samples within the credit union property. And based off those concentrations, there was not the site conditions do not present an unacceptable health risk to the bank employees or customers based off that data. However, in the event that a residential development were to be placed there based off that soil vapor data, some response action will need to be made to protect the future users. And as I mentioned before, the purpose of the response plan is a remedy selection document. It must establish specific response objectives. And for this site, the response objectives are to address on-site soil gas contamination. It must also identify the proposed remedy for this project. And the proponent also provided an evaluation of remedy alternatives to address soil gas contamination, and the proposed remedy was selected from those alternatives. One caveat in this is under the clear agreement, while evaluating multiple alternatives is not necessary, Tndc still evaluated other alternatives just to show a range in what could be done at the prep site. And yes, so the response actions considered, the first is no action. That was a baseline when you evaluate different types of response actions or remedial alternatives. No action is the baseline. Then they evaluated soil excavation, where they would, throughout the entire site, excavate soil down to 15 feet below the ground surface and all that. And then the third was a vapor intrusion mitigation system. And this would also be paired with land use controls and engineering controls, which will be discussed further. And these two were the alternative three that were proposed by Tndc in the response plan. A vapor intrusion mitigation system, it is a chemically rated vapor barrier and piping that would be underneath the proposed development. There would also be plugs installed along the utility corridors and utility piping to ensure that vapor does not migrate from the site into utilities or into the site from any off-site utilities where there may be soil vapor contamination originating from. This vapor intrusion mitigation system will be paired with a land use restriction, which would be a land use covenant with the County of San Francisco. And this would allow residential use of the property with this vapor intrusion mitigation system to ensure that this mitigation measure is protected and that it does not change its use. Then there would also be monitoring and maintenance. So with the vapor intrusion mitigation system, to confirm that it's actually effective and that vapor is not migrating inside the residential development, there will be sampling of pins that go through the slab but are completely sealed, so there's no pathway. And they're able to collect data from below the foundation and the barrier. And then they'll have sampling of indoor air so that you can see that you have, a potential, what you can see is that vapor is not migrating inside. It's a confirmation that you have data from below where the soil vapor lies, and then you have indoor air, what people are breathing in, to confirm that the mitigation system is being effective. Then there will also be annual inspections and reports to review that the barrier is not impacted or compromised in any way. And in the event that it is, there will also be repairs that will also be described in the maintenance manual as well. More information on vapor intrusion mitigation systems. They're a very proven method to develop brownfield sites that are used in the Bay Area, California, and the United States. They, again, prevent vapors and soil from entering indoor air at a building. And this one also includes perforated gas collection piping that allows the diluted contaminants and soil gas to be vented and routed and to be vented above the roof line of the building where they naturally dissipate into the atmosphere. The engineered barrier is also part of it. And you can see that here where it's a spray-on chemically rated membrane. You can see in this left picture here, and then you can see the perforated piping that would go beneath the membrane. You can see these white PVC pipes located here. With these systems as well, they're originally passive, which means that there is no mechanism that is mechanically pumping air or extracting air from the piping, but they do have that capability to be activated in the event during one of the monitoring events. Maybe there is a slight increase in concentration of some sort, or there is some type of repair that needs to be made quickly. These also have the capability of being active to become more effective, which this system is that is proposed in the response plan is. Community protection measures that would occur during the development of the response plan and during construction. The standard work areas will be fenced off with signage. There will be air monitoring stations for dust along the site perimeter. There will be real-time air monitoring using handheld devices to track chemical compounds in soil gas, and also to make sure that it is not impacting the breathing space around on-site workers or anyone off-site, outside of the fence line. And that is, you can see a picture of that here. Since PCE is a volatile organic compound, this device called a photoionization detector would actually be able to detect the concentration of volatile organic compounds in the breathing zone. And if there was a hit that posed, that caused alarm, or there was like an inhalation risk, then work could be stopped. And there, DTSC can then assess on how to make sure that there's no risk to the on-site workers or the off-site passerbyers or the community. Water, chemical suppressants, and/or plastic sheeting may be used for dust control and/or vapor. As I mentioned earlier, if there is this inhalation risk based off the photoionization detector hit, chemical suppressants may be used to limit those, but water and/or plastic sheeting may be used for stockpiling or preventing dust from migrating off-site. But also to know that this vapor intrusion mitigation system that will be coming in will also not be contributing any type of contaminant like PCE into the soil vapor plume that exists below the site. DTSC will continue to communicate with the community as this project continues on. Work notices will be distributed prior to the start of work of development of the response action, site signage with site contact information, and then DTSC will always be available for briefings with any interested parties. The proposed next steps, DTSC will evaluate all of your comments on the response plan, consider making changes as well based on the comments. DTSC will also prepare a response to comments document where many of you have already sent in comments via email or via phone, where we will have responses to those formalized and available to everyone in the community. And then the proposed next steps following the considering the comments would then be an approval of the response plan. And I will turn it over to Asha.
Thank you for the presentation, Arthur. Now we're going to move on to the public comment process. The comment period started July 12th and ends on August 13th. There's several ways you can submit comments to us, and we've already received a number of comments through email. We'll be taking your verbal comments at tonight's meeting. You can also send them to Arthur through email, by phone, or by mail through the end of the comment period. For comments that we receive after tonight's meeting, we'll acknowledge that we received your comment, but please do bear with us until after the close of the comment period to receive a written response. And those comments will be combined in a response to comments document that becomes a part of the final remedial action plan. Next slide, please. If you'd like to review a hard copy of the draft response plan, you can make an appointment at DTSC's Berkeley office and ask to speak to the file room. You can also find documents on our EnviroStore database listed here. Just type in the site name and select it from the drop-down menu. To review the draft response plan, you can find it under the Community Involvement tab. To review technical reports, you can find it under the Activities tab. And information for the offsite investigations are now also linked to the 2550 Irving Street EnviroStore site. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you need assistance, and I can walk you through it or send you direct links to any documents you request. A copy of this presentation will also be uploaded onto EnviroStore. Next slide, please. So here's contact information for both Arthur and I. Please feel free to get in touch with us anytime. If you have questions or comments about the redevelopment process, please direct those to Jackson Rabinowitz with Tndc at the contact information listed here. And that takes us to the end of our presentation. And now we'd like to open it up for public input. Just a reminder, you have two ways to participate. You can either click on the raise hand icon or use the Q&A feature. And if you're calling in, then you'll dial *9 to raise your hand. And so I'm seeing that we already have a few Q&As that came in during the course of the presentation. So I'll just take them in the order that they came in and I'll read them out loud. And then we'll look to you for a response, Arthur. So the first one is, would the DTSC have initiated indoor testing if the community had not demanded it? Why was this not done earlier in the assessment process?
I can answer that. And so DTSC became involved in mid-2020 with the Police Credit Union project. And as I mentioned before, the credit union is responsible for any offsite impacts north of Irving Street. And while DTSC has first, we collected soil vapor samples. That was the first step in all of this, is to understand how this plume in the concentrations are offsite immediately. And while we did the monitoring, we did the first and second rounds, or we requested that the credit union do the first and second round, one in September and then one in March. And then the report of this one in March was provided to DTSC in May. And while indoor air was not warranted immediately, because based off the concentrations, DTSC did not see potential unacceptable or imminent risk based off the concentrations, it was not immediately warranted to do indoor air. But we needed to collect data to establish a baseline to then come up with a plan on what's the next step in evaluating the area, which at the same time, there was a lot of, community interest and a lot of community push. And, DTSC at the same time came to the credit union, where both have come to decide to then do indoor air sampling, because that is the best way to evaluate the vapor intrusion impacts of the area. So to answer your question, it was not an imminent or immediate, action, but it was an eventuality. And this was always an eventuality.
Great, thank you, Arthur. And the next Q&A we have, I'll go ahead and read that one out loud as well. Would you please explain how construction at the site will impact the PCE vapors?
Sure. So while in any event, and what DTSC and what many of us who work on these types of projects have noticed, while you do construction, usually this is actually better for soil vapor or contaminants like these volatiles in the soil vapor, because you're giving them a pathway to the atmosphere where they naturally attenuate and dissipate. Now, based off these concentrations, we are being very cautious, and that's why we would have these handheld monitors while this construction and grading is happening, to ensure that there's not an immediate inhalation risk to the on-site workers or even, members of the community passing by on the other side of the fence line. So in any event, there would be no negative impact from what we understand to, increase the concentration or have it, pose like a more of a risk or anything like that off-site. We'd actually expect it to actually lessen the concentrations on-site. And since our understanding is the site is the source area, that would also better the impacts to the offsite.
Great, thank you, Arthur. The next, let's see, we have a hand raised. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Chuck Kwan. Go ahead and ask us your question or make your comment, please. Chuck, are you able to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, my question was that, are you just going to be air sampling and analyzing for PCE or other chemicals as well?
So originally, the sampling, when the credit union was first investigating the property in 2019, 2020, they did the full suite of analytes for TO15, which is the analysis for the majority of contaminants in the environment that are detectable. And from there, PCE was the only contaminant concern identified. Everything else was non-detect before or below screening criteria. So now our analysis focused on PCE and its breakdown products, TCE, cis-1,2-DCE, phenyl chloride. That's the suite of analyses that we've narrowed it down to, since PCE is the only contaminant concern related to the site.
Okay, thank you. Have you done a survey of people living in the area to see if they've been having health effects due to exposures to PCE?
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit.
Yeah, have you done any health surveys around the site of people to see if they've had health effects that could be associated with PCE exposures?
DTSC is not in our jurisdiction to do that. We don't specialize in clinical toxicology, so we haven't done that. So I'm sorry, we can't. That's not where where we have our jurisdiction in this. We have to focus on what the contaminants that we're working with and the sites that we're working at. But of course, we take every type of information from the community, especially with the types of impacts and diseases that have happened there, of course, into every kind of evaluation that we do once we have more information.
Okay. Are you using the exposure limits from EPA, or is it using something more stringent, perhaps from your own program?
And I believe Vivek spoke with this as well, but EPA's screening levels are much higher than DTSC's for ambient air, for PCE. Vivek, correct me on that.
Yeah, that's correct. So the state of California sees PCE as much more potent a toxicant than federal EPA does. So our screening level compared to EPA screening level for inhalation is actually 25 times more stringent because of the difference in the measure of toxicity. The exposure assumptions are the same, the default exposure assumptions for a residential scenario, but it's the toxicity value that we ascribe to PCE specifically that makes us act on it and identify it as a contaminant of concern at 25-fold lower than what federal EPA would.
Okay. Is there a groundwater system underneath the site that could be used as drinking water?
No, my understanding is it's not. And when the investigation for groundwater occurred there, the PCE was not detected above the MCLs or the ESL for drinking water, I believe. And it was not listed as a contaminant concern in that media either. In terms of its basin plan, I would have to double check on that and get back to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions, Chuck. We're going to move on to some Q&As. Folks have been waiting patiently. We can get back to you. Feel free to raise your hand a little bit later. Okay, so the next Q&A we have, what are the remediation solutions for the offsite neighbors in the future?
Sure. So that's a very good question. And it's, we're at the early stages in evaluating this, because when DTSC first acquires or, gets involved in a project or a site, we have to do, this various types of sampling, and we have to have enough data to really then go back to the responsible party or proponent and say, hey, I think it's time for a remedy to be developed. For this area, it's difficult to say. There's so many different types of remedies that you can choose, and it's kind of hard to just pinpoint one in this area. But that we choose it when we're at the point where we think that it is necessary and that the community will benefit and that the remedy will benefit the community as a whole. So right now, I can't say for sure. We're just now evaluating if vapor intrusion is happening inside the homes offsite. So we need to figure out what that looks like before we can then say, hey, it's time for a remedy. We'll keep you updated.
Great, thank you, Arthur. Okay, next we'll take another Q&A. I'll read this one out loud. Is a typical vapor intrusion system cheaper than soil excavation?
There is a cost analysis that is presented in the response plan, and I believe this soil excavation was more expensive in the short term than a vapor intrusion mitigation system. But I think it depends on the scope of the soil excavation and the size of the building that the vapor intrusion mitigation system would be. So it's very difficult to tell. But I believe in this response plan, there is a cost outlined for both of those remedial alternatives.
Great. Thank you, Arthur. Okay, next we will go to Deborah, who has her hand raised. Deborah, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, I live on 26th Avenue, and all this talk of waiting and see what's going to happen. I know for a fact that a lot of my neighbors have cancer. Long-term residents have cancer. I've lived here since 1976. I think it should just be cleaned up. Get rid of the toxins now. I don't see I know there might be some cost benefit, but for living here for peace of mind, I would feel much safer if you just got rid of these toxins. I don't want to have to be monitored for the next few years to see if I'm going to be the next one getting cancer.
And we totally hear you on that and everything. And with this site, it's like I mentioned earlier, it is under a different type of agreement than the police credit union, who is responsible for the impacts north of Irving Street offsite. So what is being proposed here and was proposed by Tndc is what we evaluate. DTSC cannot, go to someone and say, this is the way to do it. We have to evaluate, and we just don't have enough data yet to, with the credit union to address the offsite. I mean, that's coming. We're doing indoor air sampling to then evaluate what kind of risk is there at the homes closest to the property. So those, are the homes that, if they were to be impacted, those would be the ones because they're so close to the source area. They're the closest to the source area. But in terms of what Tndc is doing in this response plan, it's solely focused on their site. They're not responsible for the offsite. So that's how we have to evaluate this response plan.
We take your concerns very seriously, Deborah, and Arthur is actually going to be in charge of the investigations that are happening for the three different properties or offsite investigations north of Irving, the 2550 site, and across the street at Albright Cleaners. So we're going to be sure to stay in touch with the community and make sure that you're informed of everything that we're doing and update you whenever we have new information to share. We absolutely, take your concerns really seriously. So thank you for your comment. Next, we have another Q&A. I'll go ahead and read it out loud. Why are you not considering vapor extraction as one possible response? Doesn't it make more sense than excavation? Also, it would protect neighboring properties from a plume, wouldn't it?
DTSC, without having a formal evaluation, cannot say, yes or no, because there's so many factors that go into a successful soil vapor extraction. And of course, as I mentioned before, with the clearer process, the response, alternatives, remedial alternatives that are presented here are not necessary. And that's because of the clearer process, right? So they didn't even have to present any type of alternative. They just had to present one that DTSC comments on. So DTSC has not evaluated soil vapor extraction. So at that point, we're not able to, consider it or approve it under this response plan. And yes, that's how we've had to do it.
Great, thank you, Arthur. Next, we're going to take another Q&A. Would the DTSC have, okay, I think we already got that one. Let me go back to unanswered questions here. What was the site usage from 1947 to 1965, not included in the presentation?
Yes, I believe they were used as gas stations, and that was an overlook in our part, but we, I believe, focused mainly on the the uses that may have had any potential impact to the current PCE. But that is also something you can find on EnviroStore, but we can also follow up in the response to comments there. That information is all outlined in the various reports on the EnviroStore site, as well as the Police Credit Union's EnviroStore site and the Phase 1 environmental site assessment. But that is something we can follow up with you guys to confirm, and I will need to confirm that as well.
All right, thank you. I'll take another Q&A here and read it out loud. Does the lifetime of a vapor intrusion system outlast the time these contaminants typically persist in soil?
That's an interesting question. When we look at these systems and everything, I don't think there has been one that has outlived us yet, but when DTSC is involved and when we attach these land use covenants and, engineering controls, we are, going through and reviewing these and assuming that they will exist, for the building's lifetime, and that they have to be as effective as they're first built throughout the building's lifetime. So to answer your question, if the material or the system doesn't, survive the building's lifetime or starts to deteriorate, that will be known through the monitoring that's attached to it. And then, at that point, repairs can be made to ensure that it stays effective throughout its lifetime and the building's lifetime.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I'll take a raised hand. We haven't heard from Doreen Silk yet. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Doreen.
Hi, I have been living in the neighborhood like many of our other senior residents for over 50 years. And we have been living across the street from these dangerous chemicals for years. And I understand that I am in close proximity. And as a matter of fact, my husband is undergoing a test and a study through UCSF because he did contract Parkinson's. And so you're telling me, and we are north of this project, but you have limited it to the houses across the street. When a gas plume is a gas plume, you can't say which side of the street it's going to go. And I am hoping that despite the fact that I think they should reach farther than these building confines, which is a square block, that they should consider these immediate neighbors and clean it up. And just, mitigating it is one thing, but if you have to follow it for 10 years, who knows if I'll be around in 10 years.
We very much hear you on that. And, we're going to definitely take that comment into consideration while we evaluate, this response plan, as well as we, as we continue on with the credit union, it's going to be responsible for, the plume north of Irving Street. So.
Thank you, Doreen. Next, we have a Q&A that I'll read out loud. Why is no indoor testing being done on the south side of Irving Street?
And so that's a very good question. When the credit union was first doing their investigation, they investigated both the southern property and the northern property, or their northern current property. And while investigating the southern property, they saw that there was higher concentration along adjacent to the former Albright Cleaners, 2511 Irving Street. Through that, DTSC looked through the data and said, hey, maybe it's not just one PCE, maybe there was another release associated with the Albright. And so DTSC went through this very long search and found actually waste manifest that showed that PCE was used at Albright in the 1990s and late 1880s, and was stopped being used in 1990. And this showed us that, this is definitely a reason to believe that another, source may have come to fruition, and that is a responsibility of the Albright Cleaners, any impact south of Irving Street. And so that's where DTSC is, that's where we are now getting involved with them to then have them do all the investigations and more that's going to be necessary for all the soil vapor PCE impacts south of Irving Street.
Great, thank you, Arthur. Okay, we'll do another Q&A now, and I'll read it out loud. Excavation sounds like a better path to clean up the site, as it would reduce the PCE plume for the benefit of the new residents as well as existing ones. Is that correct? Why was the vapor intrusion mitigation chosen instead? And why doesn't DTSC push for the best possible remediation option for the site so that it benefits existing residents as well as new ones at 2550 Irving?
Okay. And I believe it's very difficult to choose soil vapor. So soil excavation, as it's proposed in the response plan, was intended to excavate across the site down to 15 feet below ground surface. And I believe one of that alternative was very difficult to achieve because logistically it would have 650 plus truckloads. But the main thing is, minus logistics and its impact on the community and, the amount of construction and nuisance would be to the community, the effectiveness as a remedy for the soil vapor plume was fairly low based off the evaluation. There, like I mentioned, a secondary release at Albright that has stayed fairly stagnant, but still seeing some off-gassing and potential off-gassing into the 2550 Irving Street property. So even though soil excavation were to occur at the 2550 Irving Street property, there may be a chance of potential recontamination. And since the site, if it did, the response plan proposed soil excavation with no vapor intrusion mitigation system, then that would also put the future residences at potential risk. So it was a lot of uncertainty, and I believe the cost did not, and the logistics of the impact to the community as well, would have definitely the alternative 3, the VIMS intrusion mitigation, the vapor intrusion mitigation system, is more effective in the long run.
Right. Thank you, Arthur. Okay, I'm going to go to another Q&A here. Let's see. In regards to the effects of construction, do you know what foundation system Tndc expects to use and its effect on spread of contamination?
And we do not know that for sure yet. And in terms of its impact to contamination, that's definitely something that we would want to understand, but we'll have to look into that more, but it will not. And DTSC will definitely be involved in this to minimize or to prevent, this development from increasing the contamination or increasing its spread. That is something that we will definitely be a part of and trying to prevent.
Right, thank you. I'll take another caller. Another hand raised. Let's see. How about the Mid-Sunset neighborhood? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, my name is Ramesha. I live on 26th Avenue. And my question is, all of the remediation or risk mitigation that's being discussed so far is limited to the 2550 Irving property. My understanding is the DTSC should protect all the residents of the state of California and not just the residents of a specific parcel of property. So why are we not thinking more broadly about this? And I understand there's the legal obligation of the Tndc and the document that you referred to earlier, which just limits their obligation to the property. But the DTSC has a broader obligation to the residents of the state of California. So that's one question. And two, I keep hearing mitigation as something that's being considered, but why are we not just focusing on remediation? I guess funding is always an issue, but it doesn't seem to be an issue for this particular project. At $1 million per unit, there seems to be lots of money flowing around in support of it. So if we're going to do it right, why not just do it above and beyond and ensure that there's no issues for the future residents of the community at 2550 or elsewhere?
Right. And so to your first question, that agreement that DTSC is under, Tndc is only responsible for the on-site and how to protect their future residents. So yes, but at the same time, DTSC would never, with the current landowner, the credit union who's responsible for the off-site north, that is something we're not going to abandon or stop being involved with until we know that there's no risk to the community outside of the 2550 Irving Street project. So this presentation is really just focused on the response action that Tndc presented to DTSC. And that's what we can only evaluate. And that's, based off just the on-site and what's proposed there. This is a very, very common mitigation measure. And this is what they proposed to us, and this is what we commented on, which DTSC believed was effective in, preventing any kind of risk to the on-site, residents. So that's why, I know the remediation thing, of course, please include it in the comments so we can consider it and bring it back to Tndc and everything. But that's what's been proposed to us in the draft response plan, and that's what we reviewed and put.
So let me ask a question. Sorry, why does Tndc have to propose the solutions? Why can't DTSC propose solutions? Isn't that like your area of expertise?
Yeah, so it's not like we can go and, we can discuss and we can recommend and evaluate and everything like that. And when this was first being brought to us, it was, and again, I can't speak on this directly because we just haven't gone to that evaluation. But theoretically, if we said, hey, do soil vapor extraction, that's the Tndc can come to us and say, no, we think a vapor mitigation system makes more sense because of X, Y, and Z. And that's what they proposed. And for an on-site measure, it's, what DTSC commented on and found appropriate. And that's why it's here.
Ramisha, would it be helpful to hear a bit more about kind of how projects come to our office and how these projects, how we get involved?
Sorry, Ms. Shetty. It's that would not be helpful. What would be helpful is to understand why the residents of the community would have to rely on Tndc to provide solutions. And to Arthur's former point, even if the DTSC made a recommendation that this is the best course of action, the Tndc could just override it and propose something that is, say, less costly or just impacts them and doesn't impact the community broadly. Like, I'm trying to understand why a government agency doesn't have more oversight of this issue. And it seems to me is bowing to the demands and requirements of a private developer.
Apologies. So
Kim,
when
I see that you're on camera here. Do you want to weigh in here? Sorry to cut you off there, Arthur.
It's okay. I misspoke earlier, and I'm so sorry. It's not like we are like bowing down to them. It's, we evaluate when we discuss, this parcel, this proponent do not have offsite obligations. So, when we were discussing, it was very much just like we had another proponent who's responsible for the offsite impacts. When we discussed with Tndc, here are the conditions, when we evaluate the site assessment plan, and we said, okay, and then your turn to prepare a draft response plan. And when they did, they came and said, here's a vapor intrusion mitigation system, soil excavation, they evaluate these different options. And that's, we presented, based off our comments, our engineering did not find it necessary for soil vapor extraction to, be a remedy for this site, and that the VIMs that they proposed was adequate. And that's why it's up for public comment right now.
Kim, would you like to embellish a bit more?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that clearly DTSC has a responsibility to protect public health in the neighborhood. So we're not confining our attention to a single alternative proposed by a developer. We have 3 projects going in the area. The project that we're talking about tonight is one of 3, and it's focused on making sure that we can do the redevelopment safely. There are 2 other projects that are going to be going on to look at the neighborhood more broadly and to make sure that we're protecting the community, the surrounding community. So I hear what you're saying, and I just want to make it really clear that DTSC is committed to protecting the public in the entire community, the entire area.
Thanks, Kim. And I should just mention too that our department is receiving funding to be able to do investigations without, waiting for a developer proponent to come to us to engage in a voluntary cleanup agreement or response plan. So there is more funding coming our way, so we can more proactively investigate properties throughout the site, and so that's really good news. And so, look to hear from us more as we continue our investigations around the state. So let me move on now to another Q&A. For what, I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud. For example, what does soil compaction do to the contamination? This is a comment from Kathleen. Kathleen, if you want to raise your hand and add a bit more to your comment so we can better understand and answer your question, that would be appreciated. Okay, I see you've got your hand up, so I'm gonna go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Hi, I'm speaking for Kathleen.
Okay.
This site will have to be excavated a minimum of 3 feet, depending on the foundation system that they choose. That material, once it's excavated down a minimum of 3 feet, will have to be compacted with machinery that forces the plume downwards towards the groundwater table. And so what is your experience with that construction technique as it relates to soil contamination?
Right, and I have seen that on other sites where you have a shallower groundwater table compared to like where the development and the foundations are being drilled down to. And, you have seen like the potential risk of, contaminating, an aquifer or groundwater with contaminated soil or soil vapor. But in this case, I believe the soil groundwater table ranged originally around 80 feet below the ground surface. I'm not entirely sure that, and in terms of soil contamination, there was no soil contamination found on site directly. There was one sample of PCE that was detected at a very, very low concentration, almost 0.002 milligrams per kilogram above the laboratory reporting limit, which is very, very much lower than the screening level. So we wouldn't expect any type of soil contamination to then go with the foundation to the groundwater table. And in terms of the PCE, soil vapor plume seems to be confined up in the upper 15 feet of the soil column. So if there were to be excavation or drilling, it would attenuate, but I would not expect the soil vapor plume to then recontaminate the groundwater. But that is definitely something I cannot confirm just yet, but something I would like to follow up with you all on, and something we will absolutely discuss with Tndc before any kind of proposed development occurs.
Great. Thank you. I'll move on to another Q&A here. 2550 on a very windy corner, what will they do to lessen the dust blowing into neighboring houses and yards?
Yeah, and what will happen with this site, and it's still being discussed, but what will definitely happen will be dust monitoring stations, as well as having during construction and grading and everything, definitely water will be used there to suppress the dust, and there will absolutely be someone there monitoring to make sure that the dust is suppressed with water so that it's not impacting the neighborhood at all. And also monitoring the dust monitors that will be on the perimeters of the site to ensure that it's not migrating off site.
Once we have the details, we're happy to share information, and we can host another meeting to provide you with the details of what that plan looks like and how we're protecting the community, because we understand that is of utmost importance to you. So right now we don't have the details, but those details will come, and we will absolutely share that with all of you. Okay, I'm going to take another Q&A here. I'm afraid the current plume will continue flowing in the next 2 years before plugging is done when building is constructed. If it's tested and deemed not dangerous later in 2021, won't that change by 2023? So should the indoor be tested again in 2 years in 2023? It's continuously flowing, so testing today would be just this year's info. What about in 2 years' time?
That's a good question. So as it relates to offsite impacts, the PCE plume right now, that's why we had the credit union install and monitor these soil vapor wells north of Irving Street. Because if we do see, and we just established what we call a baseline data set. So we had one sampling event in September, then another sampling event in March to account for the seasonal variation that can flux the concentration. And so we just established a baseline. So once this soil vapor sampled again in September, which will also be at the same time as the indoor air, then we will understand, hey, are the concentrations increasing north? Are they remaining the same? Are they decreasing? That'll show us, that'll tell us the spatial distribution of this plume, because then we know if the concentration is increasing, that plume is moving in that direction. So right now, based off what we've seen in the preliminary data, it seems to be very stable. However, we still need the September data to confirm how this plume is moving. So right now, it's not moving at an alarming rate, because at an alarming rate, you would see the concentrations increase greatly from September to March. So it's not at that point yet, but again, we need to confirm. And of course, DTSC will be doing indoor air in September, and then depending on the data, and it may likely occur again in March. But again, September will be very telling of what the offsite conditions are like.
Great, thank you, Arthur. If that answers your question, Helena. I'll move on to another Q&A. It's from Kathleen. It sounds like a mitigation approach, you are over-reliant on your trust and vapor intrusion prevention.
And these go through our engineering and special projects office, and these chemically rated barriers and this mitigation measures have various studies, and they're used at various sites, and their efficacy and effectiveness is tested and observed to be very effective in preventing vapor intrusion.
And we'll also be gathering site-specific data too to validate that the vapor mitigation system is effective, if that's the ultimate remedy that's chosen for the site.
Exactly.
Great, thank you. We'll move on to another Q&A, and then I'll take a hand raised after that. The next one is, could you discuss exposure levels and how long-term exposure is taken into your risk analysis? I see you're on, Vivek.
Yeah, I'm on. And so the screening levels that we apply for our decision framework for risk management, those address chronic exposure scenarios. So over a lifetime, a basic principle of toxicology is the longer the exposure term, the lower the concentration is tolerated over that long term. Whereas in a very short period, a higher concentration would be tolerated for the same chemical. That's just a basic concept of toxicology of a dose response relation and dose exposure relationship. That being said, exposure in this case is measured by indoor air and outdoor air samples, because that is what we call an exposure point concentration that is available for inhalation. To extrapolate from soil vapor samples, while we have screening levels for those soil vapor concentrations in the neighborhood, we are assuming a model, and we are taking a very health protective and stringent approach to the model to inform whether we act on it or not. And in this case, because the soil vapor concentrations exceed those screening levels, further action is needed. We cannot dismiss PCE as a contaminant potential concern.
Great, thank you, Vivek. Okay, I'm going to take a hand raised here. Let's see, it's a number ending in 023. Go ahead and unmute yourself, caller. You'll have to dial *6 in order to unmute yourself.
I think I did. I'm not sure.
Great. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So, Arthur, I think I heard you say that indoor air concentrations for PCE are different, rated differently, or I'm not sure if I'm using the correct terminology, for commercial as opposed to residential air. Is that correct? And
yes.
If that is correct, can you explain what the difference is and why?
Sure. Vivek, do you want to discuss that a little bit more?
Sure. Thank you for the question. It's actually based on the exposure time and exposure duration that is assumed to come up with the screening level. So under a residential scenario, we assume that someone is breathing a concentration 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 26 years over a lifetime of 70 years from age 0, so from birth through sensitive developmental milestones through age 26. So that's a 26-year duration, acknowledging that specific to this community, there are people who have lived in the community longer. Whereas in a commercial scenario, we do not assume that a commercial worker is there 24 hours. We assume 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 250 days a year for 25 years of a work tenure. And those are the default assumptions of exposure, time, and duration that go into the math that come up with a calculation of a screening level for a residential scenario and commercial scenario, respectively.
Okay, so given that information, why would the wells outside of these 6 homes be monitored without monitoring the indoor air quality of those potential residences and the residents living there? And as you said, 24 hours a day, X number of years. Why would it take the community pushing for indoor air quality monitoring before anybody would do that? Because it seems to me if you put the wells in front of these 6 homes, someone, not necessarily DTSC, but someone suspected that there might be a problem inside these 6 homes. So why wouldn't you just be proactive, monitor the air, be done with the issue?
Well, it's a stepwise process that's typical to our investigations of vapor intrusion, that we try to follow the vapor intrusion pathway, which is measure concentrations in the subsurface, and if the concentrations warrant, move to indoor air to evaluate the pathway further. So it is a stepwise process. These external soil vapor samples outside of the residence to the north, that was the first step in seeing whether the plume was actually encroaching that far north. We have data for that, and those data inform that there is a potential, I would say a small potential, but still a potential because it exceeds our screening level for there to be a vapor intrusion pathway. Those concentrations don't mean necessarily that PCE will be detected, but we are charged with going to see.
Okay.
And with community engagement and community feedback about the condition of the buildings and the age of the buildings, we are prompted that, like, yes, it's a good idea to go and look at indoor air because the attenuation might be less than what we expect it to be.
Got it. So then the numbers generated that you guys are going off of for acceptable or unacceptable levels, are they generated by you guys at DTSC, or is that state or federal?
They're generated under a federal process. So the equations that inform or allow us to calculate screening levels are from the risk assessment guidance for Superfund from US EPA. However, the toxicity value, as I said earlier, we consider in California PCE to be 25 times more toxic than EPA does as a health protective assumption to guide our investigation process. For the levels that we measure, we've measured outside of the residence. If US EPA had jurisdiction, we would not be looking at indoor air because they would have screened out.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for answering my questions and for your time.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll move things along here. Just doing a time check, we have 45 more minutes, and we do have 26 Q&As lined up here. So we'll try and get to all of these the best that we can. The next Q&A looks like it's a comment. You're our last resort. Tndc, the police credit union, have only showed they care about themselves. We need your help as a government agency funded by us taxpayers in finding a solution that cleans up this site and removes our worst health fears about what PCEs can do to us. Don't forget us. Thank you for your comment. And we take your concerns very seriously. The next Q&A is there a remediation plan for excavation to get rid of the PCE?
There was excavation proposed in the response plan. However, that evaluation was not deemed effective through their screening, that evaluation was not deemed as effective as the vapor intrusion mitigation system with the land use controls and engineering controls. Land use restrictions and engineering controls.
Right. Thank you, Arthur. Okay, our next Q&A. How big is the area of PCE invasion? Is there a map outlining the area in depth?
Yes, and so we are, when DTSC, in terms of the offsite and how it is, migrating, what the concentrations are like, there will be in the next sampling event, when we have a very robust data set of 3 sampling events. At that point, DTSC, and I will make sure a point of it is to map out the soil vapor plume as it relates to the south of Irving Street and north of Irving Street, based off the available data, and what those concentrations look like offsite to the north. So it'll be available in EnviroStore as part of the next monitoring plan, which will be taking place in September. So a report may be available in October or early November at the latest.
Great, thank you. Okay, our next Q&A. Given the high concentration at the center of the site that got flagged as unacceptable for residential use, and knowing the plume is likely flowing north-northwest, will you be measuring the soil vapors in the backyards to the north and northwest?
If we get to that's a good question. And, I would not rule that out while we evaluate in September. If we start to see some type of, it depends on what we see in indoor air, what we see in the monitoring wells outside. It may warrant additional investigation in backyards, more vapor wells there. I wouldn't rule that out completely, but that's definitely something to consider for sure as we continue to evaluate the offsite.
Thank you, Arthur. Our next Q&A looks like to be a comment. Your mission is to protect our health from toxic harm. You must require a cleanup of the site. Thank you for your comment. And I'll take another Q&A before we go to another raised hand. Why wasn't soil vapor extraction considered as an alternative by Tndc?
And as I mentioned, so with the clearer process, they do not have to evaluate alternatives. They can propose an alternative, but in this case, they just proposed soil excavation as the other remedial alternative to the vapor intrusion mitigation system. So that was not, and because the jurisdiction of the site lies solely within the site boundaries, when DTSC reviewed internally the mitigation system, then that's what they deemed was appropriate, and that was the appropriate action for the site. But of course, that's the public comment period. We're hearing you on this, and we are definitely going to consider it as we, get towards, as we go through this period.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead, caller, ending in 023.
Hello. Just with your knowledge and expertise, knowing what you know, I'm wondering how comfortable you guys would feel with soil or vapor extraction as opposed to the mitigation of vapor barrier if you were living in this building or this neighborhood. Would you feel safe? And which would make you feel safer or more comfortable?
I'm so sorry. I can't state that, unfortunately.
Kim, would you like to weigh in on our process a bit here?
Yeah, sure. So the way that I would look at that is it depends on the data that we generate, right? Because if you either for a soil vapor extraction system or for a vapor mitigation system, those systems are monitored to make sure that they're protective. So obviously, if a system fails, we're not going to be comfortable with it. We wouldn't be comfortable with it for the community. We wouldn't be comfortable with it for ourselves. So it really depends on what the data show us on the operation of these systems.
Thanks, Kim. Sure. Okay. Well, did you have something else to say, Arthur, before I move on to the next Q&A?
No, I just said thank you.
Okay, I gotcha.
Didn't know how to effectively answer that question.
All right. So the next Q&A, in your professional opinion, do you think potential outcomes for mitigation or remediation would be different if the site were to undergo a full CEQA investigation?
That is a good question, and that's something we could definitely think more on as we evaluate the public comments. But as of now, I'm not sure.
Would you like to say a little something about the CEQA process for the site?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure, as you all know, this project is exempt under SB 35, but DTSC will, still be filing a notice of exemption once the response plan has been approved, as is our process with this. But yes, we, have to abide by SB 35 and all of this as this project is exempt.
All right, thank you, Arthur. We'll move on to the next Q&A. Do you really have a good grasp of how much toxins are in the ground and how widespread the problem is?
Based off the data that we have so far, we feel like this plume, we have an understanding of its extent. However, we are still evaluating, and we, especially on the south side of Irving Street, there's still much more work to be done. And so I want you all to know, this is a problem that's very, these sites are very much on the front of our radar. It, is very much part of my life. And so, I am very much like, can you continue evaluating, investigating, whatever is needed to make sure that the community is protected.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're moving on here to the next Q&A. In the use of the site as a mortuary, did you look into the commonly used preservatives such as formaldehyde for corpses and if these chemicals also caused any site contamination?
Yes, and that was something that we looked at, and it degrades very quickly in the environment. However, one of the things that we will be, and this is part of the comments that DTSC will have that to Tndc as part of their evaluation while they are monitoring the the vapor mitigation system, will be to include formaldehyde on their suite of analyses while monitoring the system to ensure that it is not impacting the building.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next Q&A. Given the sandy soil of the site, can the plume migrate beyond the vents?
Let's see. In terms of into the site, the vapor mitigation system will be beneath the foundation of the entire site. So the system will be beneath the building in its entirety. And that is, yes, and that's part of the design plan. In terms of its migration, that's where we're, monitoring the soil vapor offsite, just to ensure that, we don't have definitive data yet to see how it's behaving spatially, but, this September data will definitely, clearly show what the plume's behavior is like in terms of its mobility. But in terms of, if it's moving at a rapid pace right now, you would see that after 2 monitoring events, and right now it does not seem to be behaving at a rapid pace. But again, we can definitely confirm and speak to more of this plume's migration, its behavior after this next sampling event in September.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next Q&A. As a taxpayer-funded agency, why doesn't DTSC push for the best possible remediation option for the site so that it benefits existing residents as well as new ones at 2550 Irving? For example, push for extraction as opposed to the vapor intrusion.
And yes, this, we are in this agreement with this particular proponent at this site. We are limited to, when they evaluated the response plan, it was limited to the site itself. But again, we are open to listening to these comments and going back to the proponent with the comments that you guys have on this proposed alternative remedy, and we will definitely be considering it.
And I don't know, Kim or Arthur, do you want to speak to that we're a cost recovery organization, and not everything is funded by taxpayers?
Yes, and we are under cost recovery. I think Kim could speak more to this as a unit supervisor, but yes, we do see cost recovery from our proponents and responsible parties.
Would you like to weigh in on that, Kim?
Sure. I don't know if cost recovery is very meaningful for the public.
I know. Exactly. I was hoping you'd embellish.
So basically what it means is that we are largely funded by the entities that come to us either proposing a redevelopment and wanting our oversight for the redevelopment, or a responsible party responsible for contamination at a site. So a large proportion of our funding comes directly from what the community might call the polluters.
Great, thank you, Kim. Okay, we're going to move on to the next Q&A. What about the east and west sides of Albright?
And yes, so east and west of Albright cleaners, that again will definitely be investigated. Definitely, that's absolutely on the plans, on my preemptive plans already, and DTSC's plan for having Albright involved in the project and evaluating those areas, just so we have an understanding of what the conditions are like there. So it's on the radar, it's coming. We just don't have definitive times yet. But of course, with the site, Asha and I will be keeping you updated from the community front as site, activities actually commence, and continue on.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to the next Q&A. Does public comment determine the appropriate response plan? Why? If the public wants vapor extraction, will that be considered?
Yeah, and my understanding is yes, we will definitely consider them, and that's why we have the public comment. The public has a lot of weight in this. So to answer your question, we would consider all of them with a lot of weight. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next Q&A. Then why not do both excavation and vapor intrusion?
And I believe that it has to do with more of a cost analysis, and the cost would be pretty exorbitant from my understanding. But if that is a comment from the public that you're proposing, that is definitely something we can also discuss with Tndc to see, what the feasibility might be.
Okay, thank you. Our next Q&A. What information do you currently have that the north and south plumes may have come together? How do you assign responsibility at that point? Will there be more investigation needed to determine this?
Yes, and the credit union and the Albright cleaners, if that were to be the case, and the data can prove that they both commingled on Irving Street, then there may be that could be the responsibility of both proponents or parties. So as we investigate more, as we have more understanding of the plumes, then we can start to understand what's the best course of action and who or whom is responsible for it.
All right, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next Q&A. Given the chance of recontamination of the northern lot by the more contaminated southern lot, why not come up with a remediation plan that covers both lots?
A good point. I think we just need to do more. And, it also has to do with a little bit of a liability. It has to do with liability, right? So the Albright Cleaners is going to be liable for the southern impacts once it's confirmed that once more investigations taken place on their site in south of Irving Street. But again, it's you guys are involved in this in the very early process, DTSC being involved. So we just are still in that evaluation phase where there's a lot more questions, than answers. But in terms of this project right here, with Tndc, there was enough data collected on the site, enough data to determine a appropriate response action. So this, is, what's being proposed here as a plan. But what in terms of the offsite impact, what's south of Irving Street, there's still much more work to be done before we can, effectively say, here's what's a remedy selection document. Here's what needs to happen.
Yeah, and I know that's something that we've heard, several times. And I wonder, Kim, if you would have any light to shed on, the ability to, coordinate these multiple efforts at one site, even though it's different responsible parties, and if there's a way in which we could look at it more holistically, and you don't have an answer for that, that's fine. But if you want to pontificate, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I just think one of the best ways that we can look at the area holistically is having the same project manager to work on these 3 projects, because Arthur is very well versed in the data that have been collected so far. And he'll be looking at all 3 projects overlapping. So I think that's probably one of our best ways of doing that.
Right. Thanks, Kim.
Sure.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next Q&A. We want remediation of the block, not just mitigation of 2550. That hurts the neighborhood, and it will damage the relations between the people who live in the protected building and the rest of us. We'll take that as a comment, unless there's anything you'd like to add, Arthur. I think it's a similar topic, as we're talking about just we are very interested in the whole area. And the way in which we are going to be working on it is it may appear to be a piecemeal approach, but we will be, like Kim said, Arthur is going to be looking at all of these and how they come together. So we'll do our best to, for the purpose of this meeting, it's a public comment period for this particular site within these particular boundaries. But future meetings, we'll do our best to share and where there's the intersection of all those investigations and provide a more holistic approach. All right, thank you for that comment. Okay, moving on to the next Q&A. As I understand, Tndc's loan for 2550 Irving is contingent on the fact that DTSC is happy with and approves the mitigation plan. So it seems like DTSC has the power to push for the best possible solution here. Why doesn't DTSC push for the best possible solution then?
Best possible solution is very subjective in this, because we don't know if, I'm assuming you're saying soil vapor extraction is the best possible solution. That is an unknown in this. And Tndc, with their agreement and with what they're under with DTSC, they only had to propose 1 response action. They did 2, and what we were evaluating, and we couldn't, even what we were evaluating, we couldn't just think like, the SVE is soil vapor extraction is better because of X, Y, and Z. We just didn't have, the information to make that decision. So in terms of what's best for the community, that's really difficult to say. And again, it's very tough, because this is really their liabilities solely lie within their property boundaries. And I know it's difficult to hear, but that's where Tndc is, and that's where this response plan is geared towards.
Great, thank you, Arthur. Did you want to weigh in, Kim?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that DTSC would not accept a proposed response that wasn't fully protective of human health. So that threshold has to be met by any alternative or any remedy that's proposed. So then a number of other criteria might come into play, and community acceptance is one of those criteria. And that's why we're here tonight, to take the community's input.
Thanks, Kim.
Sure.
Okay, we have, I'll take a raised hand here. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Stokes IMAC.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I've actually also provided this comment in the Q&A, but as we were running out of time, I just wanted to make sure this was getting on the record. For the record, there are many of us who are deeply concerned that sidestepping the CEQA process is not in the best interests of the future residents of this site, as well as the surrounding neighbors. Who will be held accountable years from now if issues arise with health impacts to residents because a thorough process was not followed at this point? Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. And from my understanding, Arthur, right, with Albright Cleaners, that's through a voluntary cleanup agreement, so that will be going through a CEQA process, correct?
Correct. Yeah, that would be that would likely be undergoing that if it were to go through, like, once it goes through a remedial process. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'll take another Q&A here. Looks like perhaps it's a comment. I would recommend DTSC host another session that doesn't directly conflict with weekday dinner schedule, perhaps Saturday morning session when more of the community can be available to understand these impacts. I can respond to that one. We do take into consideration what the best availability is for the community. And what we did find when we sent out the community letter and survey is that most folks said that weekday evenings would be best, but we're happy to supplement with a Saturday morning session. Like Arthur had mentioned, we are available for briefings to any interested parties. So please do get in touch with us if you have a group that would like to participate in a Saturday morning session. Also, we're recording this meeting, so this will be posted and available to anyone who missed it. And so, we do hope that folks who weren't able to join us view the recording and provide us with any feedback they have after viewing the recording. Now I'll move on to another Q&A. Has there been a class action lawsuit in the past regarding insufficient PCE mitigation plan from a developer of a piece of land?
I'm not sure, actually.
Kim, do you know?
I haven't heard of one, but I don't know. It's possible.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to our next Q&A. For example, push for both extraction and vapor intrusion. I think, did we have a similar comment like this previously?
Okay, yeah, thank you for your comment.
Okay. Okay, our next Q&A is the PCU required to disclose any health impacts on both current mentioned in the presentation and past employees, which may be related to site toxins?
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak to that. I do not know, but again, I'm not sure if they're allowed to disclose that or if they should or not. I can't speak to that. I'm not sure if anyone or Kim or Vivek would know that either. But it sounds like it's out of our jurisdiction.
Okay, in that case, we'll move on to the next Q&A. Has it occurred to DTSC that Tndc lawyers have invented 3 projects to obfuscate and confound responsibilities of the vicinity?
I'm not sure. I
take that as a comment. Okay, our next Q&A. You know that the plumes levels to the east and west measured at the street curb are lower, but the plume is rolling north and you have not measured north of the site, correct? So do we know the levels to the north and how far north before they drop off to an acceptable level?
And we do have concentration, or we do have sampling locations north of the 2550 Irving Street property. And as I mentioned, they are at the levels that for soil vapor screening level, they do exceed a screening level, but they're not at the potential unacceptable risk level. So again, once you exceed the screening level, it means more evaluations necessary, like where we're proposing indoor air. And as another commenter mentioned, based off the indoor air, we cannot rule out further investigation north, depending on how those results come back. But yes, they're not at a level where it's a potential unacceptable risk for residential land use. And that's based off soil vapor. But again, we're evaluating indoor air because we want to be extra sure and extra protective.
Great, thank you. We'll go to our next Q&A. What if the monitoring system detects vapor intrusion failure after the floor slab is poured? do you have to have do you have to have a jack? Do you have to? I'm getting tongue-tied here. Do you have to have a jackhammer? Do you have to jackhammer the concrete out to correct the failed vapor barrier?
Yeah, so there's saw cutting involved. With past experience with vapor barriers, there's usually when there's like some type of like damage to it, either when there's like plumbing or utility work that, that's usually regulated, but sometimes mistakes happens with, a contractor who does not, may not be aware that there's a vapor barrier there, but that is something that, we have gotten a lot, DTSC regulates very well to prevent that from happening. But, when it's usually along utility line work is what I'm trying to get at. And at those situations, you do have to go back and, do saw cutting or, other types of, ways to get into the barrier to repair it effectively.
Thank you. Move on to the next Q&A. So if you're a cost recovery agency, then does Tndc directly pay to DTSC for this process?
Yes, they cover the cost of the project that they bring to us for oversight. That doesn't mean that they have the ability to control the way that we do the oversight or the types of comments we might make or the input that we have to the project. That's based on science and engineering and our commitment to protect the public health.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
Move on to our next Q&A. I'm sending a +1 for vapor intrusion mitigation and extraction as my community response. I am one of the immediate neighbors that are heavily impacted by the development and contamination. Thank you for your comment. Moving on to the next Q&A. How long would vapor extraction take? It looks like there's 3 questions here. I'll just read them all 3, and then we can just go through one by one. Number 2, how do you know both plumes did not originate with Albright? Number 3, is this situation common or unique? 2 plumes, etc. So let's start with 1. How long would vapor extraction take?
That's difficult to estimate right now because we don't have, enough information, or we haven't performed, we haven't reviewed an assessment of soil vapor extraction, because usually it comes with a work plan and usually do have like a pilot study. There's many factors to, evaluate a soil vapor extraction system's effectiveness. So we do not know. That's the meat of it.
Okay, and then number 2, how do you know both plumes did not originate with Albright?
So that was the original hypothesis when DTSC was first involved. However, while DTSC was reviewing soil data collected at the credit union site, there were 66 soil samples collected at various depths, and there was one detection of PCE at the former dry cleaner location. And at that point, because then when you were looking at the data, you saw high concentration south of Irving Street, a slight dip as you went north, and then the concentration increased again. And that's when DTSC then noticed the detection of PCE in soil and said, oh, actually, and based off the former use of the site, seems to be that there's 2 PCE plumes instead of just 1.
And then the third question, is the situation common or unique? 2 plumes, etc.
I have not observed it at my site, but it is a pretty common phenomenon to have separate release sources depending on the site history use. There are many, many contaminated sites with commingled plumes of various different types of contaminants. I can tell you that for sure.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to the next Q&A. Is vapor extraction the only remedy that would protect the surrounding homes from potential plume movement?
That's kind of hard to say, right? Because you have to evaluate how effective soil vapor extraction would be in the first place. And without the proper evaluation and data, it would be wrong for me to say yes or no right now.
Okay, we're moving on here to the next Q&A. Following on the question above, shouldn't you know if the PCU closed its second floor offices due to toxics and moved to other locations to unload an unsafe building on the taxpayers?
And so based off DTSC's evaluation of the indoor air data and based on discussions with the credit union actually not abandoned, I believe they moved to a new headquarters. And that's why there were rooms that were in an area of the building that wasn't occupied. But based off the indoor air data that was collected in the areas that were occupied and that were actively used and that were ventilated and everything, naturally, the concentrations were below screening levels. And even with the samples taken in the building or the areas that weren't occupied, there was I believe they were slightly above screening criteria, but they weren't at the point where it was like a health risk or like a potential unacceptable health risk either. So.
Okay, thank you. It looks like the next one looks to be a comment. Okay. Yes, it's insufficient to mitigate and protect just the 2550 parcel residents. If the contamination goes beyond the border of the parcel, either emanating from 2550 or flowing under it from the southern lot, then the best solution would be to protect all the affected residents, not just those at 2550 Irving Street. And as someone who's raising babies and children across the street from a monitoring well for most of their first 26 years, I'd like to know the plumes beyond the borders of 2550 are removed, not just monitored for 1/26 of their life or mitigated just for 2550. Thank you for your comment, Joan. Moving on to our next Q&A. How difficult is it to clean up the toxin completely?
That's a tough question to answer. I can't speak to that just yet because you would have to evaluate a remedy, and we'd have to see how effective that remedy would be given the site conditions, the contamination. It's tough to say right now.
And we'll have more information to share as we continue to do other investigations.
Absolutely. And as the project progresses, and remedies become more realized, we'll absolutely keep the public involved, and you'll have more information on how effective this will be and how it will impact the community, how better the community.
Yes, we're just getting started here. So
we're just getting started.
Yeah. So okay, we've got our next to last Q&A in the queue. We've got one raised hand, and we've got about 10 minutes left. So I think we're doing great with addressing your questions and hearing your comments. So thanks for bearing with us. Okay, so our next Q&A here. This development will span the whole block and come with a massive amount of funding from the city, state, and federal levels. This seems like a perfect opportunity for the DTSC to demand now that the Tndc's plan include both extraction and vapor intrusion mitigation for the best benefit for the neighborhood, as there might not be another opportunity like this for the community. All right, thank you. We'll take that as a comment. And let's see, our last Q&A, and I'll move to our raised hands. Thanks for bearing with us here. Does it make more sense to clean it up completely before you actually start building anything on it?
And, when we evaluated the response plan, that's tough. Again, you have to evaluate the cleaning remedy and everything, but based off the response plan and what our engineers and what, we had DTSC reviewed in the response plan, it is protective. The proposed remedy is, anticipated to be very protective. And of course, we have, caveats tied with that of, sampling and monitoring and everything tied to it to make sure that it is, and the people, and the future residents will be protected.
Right, thank you. That takes us through our Q&As, and let's see, how about our caller ending in 023? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, it looks like I was beat to the question.
Okay.
Previously, one of our community members asked if public comment would help inform DTSC of a potential remedy if we are so allowed, and if we wanted vapor extraction as the remedy, would that be considered? And I just want to go on record as saying I want vapor extraction.
Great. Thank you so much for your comment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Jean, you have your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I asked questions earlier because about how difficult it is to clean up the toxin. Because I heard like you say, well, we're gonna do all these monitoring, we're gonna do all that while we're working on it. That just seems so dangerous. What if there's something slipped through the crack? And then, because from my standpoint, it's always to thorough clean up the neighbor, everything. Then you build on it. It would be safer to say, hey, let's build on toxic land first and then put on these barriers. And then let's hope that nothing happens, nothing creep. I mean, what's going to happen to people who's living there? It's going to be families. I mean, just because it's low income people doesn't mean that their life doesn't matter. You know, I mean, I'm really concerned about this because I feel like this is something that doesn't seem right. If you're going to do something right, you should do it from the start. Not
right.
like,
and
you
so,
know, if you don't know how much it's going to cost to do, then shouldn't you wait and do more research, provide that before? Then you analyze to see if this plan is actually, you know, feasible to do. Sometimes the land might not be, or it will cost too much because I'm a taxpayer. I don't want my money to be clean, you know, to be wasted, you know, on doing something that's extra and not safe. I mean, we built these affordable housing to help people, not to put them in like some sort of, we don't know, you know, whether, because I'm concerned about this because my dad passed away from cancer. And my mom, a couple of years ago, you know, she had surgery. So this is very real. Cancer is very real. You don't know yet. So, I mean, are you going to to me, the easiest thing is to clean this up and then reuse this land. I don't understand why you have to build on it first when there's so many issues.
And in the response plan, they propose a measure that prevents vapor intrusion, which is the media and contaminant where the contaminant of concern lies. There are measures in place to prevent that from impacting the future residents there.
And I wonder
are those 100% foolproof though? That's my question.
They're very effective remedies that are used throughout the state, and not to be this perspective, at concentrations much greater than what we find here. And they're very effective in preventing vapor intrusion.
And I wonder, I don't know if Kim, you or Vivek want to speak about exposure pathways,
right?
And in evaluating proposed remedies.
Yeah, so under the operations and maintenance plan for a vapor mitigation system as the one proposed in the response plan, it would undergo several rounds in perpetuity of monitoring, which includes sampling the subsurface for soil vapor and doing paired indoor air sampling. It would undergo an engineering review at DTSC. It would undergo annual inspections. And like Arthur said, it's a very common remedial alternative that's selected at such sites where volatile organic compounds are contaminating the subsurface because of the ubiquity of volatile organic compounds in the Bay Area.
And just to be clear, that validation, that data collection happens before occupancy is allowed in these buildings. Then once the buildings are occupied, the monitoring continues over time.
So what happens if people start moving and then you monitor and then there's something leak out? Then there will be additional costs, continual costs, right, to go into it, right? Then that's my question. Wouldn't it be more effective to, when you have nothing on the land right now, wouldn't it be easier to just clean it up first? Versus where you have buildings and people in it, then you're trying to clean up using jackhammer or whatever. Wouldn't that be more disruptive? and costly?
Vivek or Kim, could you speak to the levels that have been set? I think maybe touching back to the screening levels and how these measures are quite stringent and extremely protective.
I can speak really quickly. Just like, yes, if you say like theoretically, if this system did not work and it's the air is sampled and before occupancy, then you can't occupy. I mean, DTSC has to allow a building permit to be closed out for occupancy to occur. DTSC, gives an approval for that. And if the levels are not at the level that we find are not like adequate for people to be there, then there will be no occupancy, which is very difficult, to hear.
I see what you're saying, but do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Once you're there, you already have we already spent like what, 100 million in building this thing, but then there's no occupancy. If it's like the air, does that even make sense? You know what I mean? That's what I'm trying to say. Like, what if you built this thing and then the whatever measure you guys try to do does not work? And just say, okay, people can't live in it. Now you have this 7-story building that taxpayers spend like what, $100 million in building this over the course of how many years? And it's sitting there still.
Right. So it's not like they're like, no one can live here ever. There are more measures that need to take place. These systems also have the capability of being active, which increases their effectiveness. And that, can also lower the levels in the air. But again, and there can be, it's not like the building is just going to be abandoned if DTSC says, hey, the levels are not right yet. We could take additional measures. And it's early to speak on that. But that would be the game plan if that were to happen.
Vivek, did you have something to add to that?
Oh, Arthur addressed it. I was going to speak to the ability for these systems to be upgraded. So once again, our process is always data driven, right? So if we see problematic data, we usually have decision rules and response actions that can address to ameliorate the concentrations. So Arthur spoke to the conversion of a system from a passive ventilation system for vapor mitigation to an active one where you're actually running fans and actively ventilating the subsurface.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for sharing your concerns and questions, Jean. We do have another Q&A that I'll move on to, and then this will be our last before we wrap up the meeting this evening. So it says, if you discover a problem while monitoring, how does it get fixed?
Would you like to elaborate that a little bit more, please, so I can answer properly?
Let's see if the anonymous attendee who submitted that Q&A, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand so you can share a bit more with us, that would be very helpful. Or if you want to type in another Q&A to add on to it. I think maybe just speak about the monitoring process, about annual inspections and what happens if we do see, something that isn't going well, going smoothly.
Yeah, if we do, in the monitoring process, if we do see a level rise above that unacceptable risk level, if it starts to show concentrations, even outside of someone's home, of a risk level that may be potentially unacceptable or, harmful, then, DTSC will take, an imminent action to make sure that, the receptors, people in the area are safe. And that can be a variety of things of, increasing ventilation, if it, it's going on site. There's many different things that we could do, but I would let you know that DTSC, depending on what the levels were like and what, the media was impacted, there would be an immediate action. Just, that is something that we will definitely be a part of immediately. It would not be a wait and see kind of situation.
Okay, Thank you, everyone. That was a very robust conversation. Thank you for spending the evening with us. I wanted to share that Supervisor Marr was not able to be with us this evening due to a family emergency. I just really wanted to thank you and keep the questions and comments coming. You do have until August 13th, and we do want to hear from you. And if you feel like you want to add on to anything that you've said or something else that wasn't addressed, or you'd like to have more of an in-depth response, please do reach out to us. That concludes our public meeting this night. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.